Well, thanks for having me, Justin. My name is Bob Bussel. I am professor emeritus at the University of Oregon. I have a background in history, particularly the history of the union movement and the working class in the United States, but I also have a broader set of historical interest as well. I retired 4 years ago, still active in a number of ways, and I've really had a 50-year career associated with the union movement in one form or another, including over a decade working on union staffs and then almost 30 years working as a university-based labor educator.
Yeah, and I mean, we are in kind of a major, I guess, major labor crisis, I guess is what we're going to call this for right now with AI and all this kind of fun stuff. You're actually working on a book right now, is that right?
Yes, I'm working on a book that, broadly speaking, is we're billing it as a popular history of wages in America. And the working title is actually taken from the Women, WNBA Players Association's demand in bargaining, which is pay us what you owe us. So the idea is to really trace over a very lengthy period of time in US history how the idea of the value of someone's labor got determined, how we define the value of labor and the different contending forces that have grappled with this question, with a particular focus on working people and how they have framed and presented their demands about what they should be paid for the work that they do.
Yeah, and so you sent me a little bit of a draft, the first 10 or so pages of the book, and you actually open up talking about shoe workers. So tell me a little bit about how you went about deciding where you would start your book, because labor is such a broad history. So where did you decide to start?
Yeah. Well, I have to confess that I haven't written the very first chapter yet. I've worked my way starting up really post Civil War. But for years, I've been aware there's this famous case in American uh, labor history called the Cordwainers trials in 1806. And Cordwainers was what shoe workers were known as at that time. And it was a famous case that really essentially gave employers lots of rights as far as setting wages for workers. And there's a the the transcript, that has a really interesting cover, which talks about, it's a trial of the cordwainers for a conspiracy to fix and raise their wages. So you get an idea right from the beginning about how the employers viewed that. And the courts ruled against the workers. They said, the workers said, we have some right to decide the value of our labor. Their employers said, no, you have no right to make that decision. And the court ruled that it was an illegal conspiracy to fix their wages, and they ruled against them. So that set the tone for how wages were determined in this country for a lengthy period of time. So that to me would be an important starting place.
Yeah, and so, I mean, how did you even find out about this trial here? Because I feel like when people start talking about labor history, you kind of learn a little bit about it in school, but it's never the big important moments. It's always kind of, well, we got a new deal and then things like this. So, where did you discover this trial?
Well, going back to, let's see, when I started graduate school 40 years ago, I worked with a wonderful guy, just passed away, Nick Salvatore, who was really one of the foremost historians of his generation. And Nick was a type of guy, this has served me well in various ways in life, is that you start with the fundamentals, before you start, sort of like you learn how to do the two-hand chest pass before you dunk the basketball, so to speak, if that works. Uh, but the idea was that you would read some of the foundational documents in terms of labor and working class history. So there's one of the famous early scholars of industrial relations was a guy named John R. Commons, who taught at the University of Wisconsin. And he wrote about the shoe workers, and that led to learning about this case. So for me, it was really reading the founding documents, as it were, about US labor history, both primary sources, which the trial transcript is, and then secondary sources, and building from that foundation to read and look at other things. So I was introduced to this pretty early in my graduate school history education.
Yeah, and so when you're looking through the kind of different layers of this, how are you going to kind of move your story forward? You know, you start with the shoemakers, but obviously there are multiple ways in which labor has been exploited in this country. You know, we're talking slavery, 1806, I believe, is before the end of slavery. I think I'm not totally great with years, but I think so. So how do you move forward there?
Well, in several ways. Again, I haven't written that early chapter yet completely, although I've done some work on this. But you look at just what were the understandings about wages and how they were set, and then start to trace that moving forward. And of course, in the early part of American history, you had um, it was a master journeyman apprentice system. This is before big factories came in and production was organized on a larger scale. And the idea there was that you'd start out as an apprentice learning a trade, whether it's making shoes or printing or baking or whatever it was. And then you would eventually rise to be a journey person. You'd have enough skills that you would begin to get paid more, actually get paid and learn more. And then finally, you could be, as they called it then, a master. You would own your own small shop or small business, and then you would essentially be your own entrepreneur, entrepreneur. And that system began to break down with the rise of manufacturing. And then the big transition is that workers go to from essentially you got paid based on the custom work that you did. We don't do this much nowadays. Are you familiar with the term bespoken?
I'm not. Could you?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting word because the idea was that you would order something, they called it bespoke work. And it was, say I want a jacket, a suit, a coat, or a pants, or whatever. A tailor would customize them for you. You still hear that term a little bit nowadays, not so much anymore. In fact, tailors, they hardly exist, but I'm old enough to remember them. But you would say, you would agree on, what's the price for this? And that's workers got paid on the basis of a custom product and a certain price that they would essentially negotiate. Roughly, these were kind of precursors to unions with their employers. So it wasn't so much a wage as that you were negotiating about the price and the value of your labor based on the skill and time that went into it. And then there's a big transition following as you move forward in the 19th century to being a wage laborer, that you actually get paid a wage that the employer pretty much determines. But you begin to have the rise of unions and people talk about they want to negotiate, what that wage is. And there's a lot of back and forth and conflict, over what's an appropriate wage. And then you get into, there's a lot of stuff. How do we define a wage? The idea is that a fair wage, a living wage, a decent wage, a family wage. The thing that kind of got me onto this is the many adjectives that we have that we put in front of wage that define it. And there's been a fierce and ongoing minimum wage. There's been a fierce and ongoing contest about that really throughout our history.
Yeah, and so why are there so many adjectives? Because there are, you just mentioned a whole bunch of them. I think the ones that I'm most familiar with are minimum wage and living wage. I think those are the big
Mm-hmm.
ones right now. But what are some of the other adjectives and where did they come from and where did they go?
Yeah. Well, let's see. One, the idea was family wage. So this was an idea, and again, it was rooted in the idea that women's working was not something that was broadly accepted or condoned. The idea was, the home was the woman's, that's where women ruled the roost and were most needed as preservers of the family. So a man, you needed a male breadwinner, and a male breadwinner should earn enough to support a family, hence the idea of a family wage. And we've had that idea within our culture for a long time, although, as I like to say, of course, and many others, women have always worked. They just didn't always get paid for it. Just like we had so much unpaid labor throughout our history. I mean, certainly enslaved people weren't paid for their labor. Their labor was essential to both the rise of American capitalism and moving forward within our culture. or indentured servitude. There's a range of ways in early America that people actually weren't really paid for their labor. So the family wage comes out of the idea, though, of a male breadwinner. Um, Fair wage was something more the idea of fair day's pay for a fair day's work. And there, the idea was there should be some reciprocity here, that if I'm giving you a certain amount of work a day, there should be something that would fairly compensate me. But you begin to see the terms are slippery, because then we would say, well, what's an American standard of living? That's a term that gains credence, or a living wage. And just again, briefly, there's so much effort, as there was in the late 19th century and well into the 20th. People would develop these budgets. Experts would say, here's the budget for rent, for food, for clothing, for joining a fraternal organization, being a member of a union, recreation, and what would be that look like? And then you have the Catholic Church. There's a famed encyclical from Pope Leo called Rerum Novarum, and they talked about a frugal or minimal level of comfort. So there's a lot of dispute about what that is. And of course, we know now the minimum wage federally hasn't increased in 20 years. I think it's still $7.25 at the federal level. Most of us know, I mean, God, that's barely a subsistent wage in most places. Yet we still have that. So I think the idea has been to try to set some sort of floor, but now you see more and more of the fight for 15, in fast food, and it's gone on to other places. And the last thing I'd say on this is that the minimum wage, almost every time it goes on the ballot at the state level, increasing it, it gets approved. So it's a popular idea. And I think there's a widespread agreement that people just aren't earning enough to live on. And of course, now affordability is the buzzword. But affordability is certainly tied into, do you earn enough to be able to buy the basic necessities of life and perhaps a little bit of enjoyment beyond that? So the question remains with us.
Yeah, and so it is interesting because, talking about the minimum wage that hasn't been updated in, it's probably over 20 years at this point. But, excuse me, during the 1900s, we actually did see federal action being taken for labor. So what changed? What happened? Why isn't Congress able to help these workers?
Well, if you're talking now, I think there still is a sense, at least at the federal level, that, well, one is, leave it to the states. The states can make their own decisions. That the cost of living varies. I think this is one of the rationales. The cost of living varies from state to state. So let the states decide that. Or also the sense that the minimum wage is, it's really kind of a temporary thing for most people. That most people start off maybe at a minimum wage job, but they move up through the ranks on that. And then it used to be the notion was that women were working for pin money. I mean, a lot of these are discredited, but I think there's still a way in which some of these things linger on. Yeah, I have to say it's problematic to me. It's hard for me to understand justifying a wage that's that low, but I also think there's the fear too that then you start to price people out of jobs. That the notion is these aren't workers that are particularly productive. If you raise the wage, then the company or whoever employs them have to start raising their prices. And there's a lot of contested studies about all of this. But I think that's part of the argument as well, that you begin to, it's anti-competitive, and you begin to price businesses out, and they just simply can't, given their small profit margins in a number of industries, or purportedly they can't afford to do it. Although I think that argument has been rejected broadly by the electorate in many states. In fact, I'm hard pressed to think of a statewide referendum where the minimum wage increase was actually rejected in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, and so I think once we get into that time period of workers, because we got the New Deal, from FDR, and we saw a big explosion of unions, but we don't see unions much anymore. So unions were able to help raise these workers' wages by picketing and striking and collective bargaining. We don't see them much anymore. What happened to all of our unions?
Well, yeah, it's a big question. Let me try to at least briefly say a few things, and then we can explore it, more deeply. But I mean, let's start with the fact that at its peak, the union movement in this country in the early 1950s represented just over a third of the workforce. That's at its peak. And now, what is it? It's around 10% or so. And the private sector, even more glaringly, it's just 6% of private sector workers are represented by unions. So it really is people that work in the public sector at state, county, or municipal levels of government that are actually holding those numbers up. Um, I think a lot has to do with just the perpetual fierceness of opposition to unions. I have this, well, when I teach, I've had this title. I say, if for some of my talks or classes, that if you wanted to do a soundtrack for the American Union movement, Against All Odds might not be a bad choice, because the nature of that opposition has changed over the years, certainly from more violent forms of opposition, repression, the use of courts, injunctions, uh, militias, private police, all of that, to now a labor law that is pretty weak as far as protecting the right, certainly of private sector workers to organize. So I think those are some of the factors. Of course, the movement of businesses to parts of the country that don't have a union tradition and have weaker supports, the rise of right to work laws, offshoring. And I will say, too, that there is certainly an individualist strain in our culture. I don't want to overplay that, but I think there is a resistance on the part of some, people. I don't need this union. I can do these things on my own. I don't need to pay dues. I don't need support. But there's also just this broad litany of anti-unionism and preachment against it that is quite present in our culture, that's played a role as well. So it's a complicated set of things that have led us to this point.
You said something that was really interesting right in there. Militias and secret police. Those were used to suppress union movements?
Yeah. Well, I say private police is probably the more accurate term, but yes, if you go back to the 19th century, and the other thing is we have this notion, in our legal system and in our culture, that very much protects property rights or elevates those over the rights, say, of workers or communities, and the idea of freedom of contract. So, the idea is that we have a freedom to contract for employment. I can vote with my feet and leave. You can fire me. So, if you're familiar with the term at will employment, and that in almost all states in the private sector, pretty much you can be fired for any reason, as long as you're not a member of a protected class and subject to civil rights law, or there's some other categories. But employers then have enormous power, and they use that when workers try to organize. And you see now with Starbucks and Amazon, for example, it's not so much now that you need that type of force. You can actually use the law and drag things out and uh, intimidate and fire people and do those sorts of things. So sometimes I like to, it's kind of a black humor, is to say that it's no longer the brickbat or the private police or the militia. It's the lawyers, attaché case, and laptop that are probably the hardest rival for workers attempting to organize nowadays. But yeah, there's all these examples of really bitter. We had some of the most bitter labor conflict in the among Western industrial democracies in this country, and particularly around the idea. I think that employers really want freedom of action to manage their business as they see fit. And while they probably aren't that excited about paying better wages or benefits, I think the idea of exercising power and control really drives anti-unionism, and led employers to use some pretty tough tactics, violent tactics, really, particularly throughout the late 19th and well into the 20th century.
Yeah, I think we've had a pretty you're correct. We've had a pretty violent history when it comes to labor. In Idaho, there was an assassination of a governor over labor rights. Another form of wage that you mentioned in this intro draft you've sent me is tipping. So tell me a little bit about where tipping kind of came from and how it's impacted Americans' abilities to make this living wage, this correct
Mm.
wage.
Yeah, yeah, I haven't, and I have to say I haven't quite written the piece on tipping yet in the book, but I will say that it certainly has its roots in rather the post Civil War period, and certainly black workers were very much a part of that, working in service occupations. It became most one place that became particularly known, prevalent, was with Pullman porters, people who were porters on Pullman trains, and that the idea, and again, it's rooted in certain types of racist and servile assumptions, a kind of continuation of a certain form of servitude, is that you don't pay people a wage, you pay them a tip. And of course, to get a tip, as anyone knows, it's it's about the level of service you provide and the desire or even whim or whatever of somebody who's receiving that service. So you begin to see it in various types of service industries. And it's interesting because I think there's some ambivalence you see on the part of workers. On the one hand, you see a lot of people saying, this is servility, this is un American. We shouldn't have to either literally or figuratively kind of tap dance or be servile in terms of getting a wage that we could actually live on or live on decently. But then on the other hand, people would say, I'd rather, if it's a choice between having the tips and not having them, I'd rather have them, especially if you're not going to give me a wage that I could live on. So there's big struggles, certainly in one of the the major battlefields for this were the railroads, people, mostly black men that worked on Pullman cars, and redcaps, mostly black men who worked as porters in railroad stations and bus terminals, those sorts of places. And there was a real fight on to try to get an actual wage rather than having to rely on tips. And even now, you see, if you look at the restaurant industry, there are a number of states, they call it a tip credit, that you get a minimum wage that maybe it's $2 or $3 or whatever it is an hour, and then your tips are supposed to bring you to a minimum wage. If they don't, then you get it, it's supposed to be replaced. And again, you saw in the last political campaign, Donald Trump made a whole thing about no tax on tips, and it had some level of popularity. Restaurants, I think, have experimented with doing away with tips. We've seen the tipping thing now with swiping your card and all of that goes on, and what's a reasonable tip, and what's the tip do both to the person who receives it and the person who's supposed to grant it? It's a complicated type of, I use the word transaction broadly, but that's a little bit of the history of it. I have to say there's a lot. And then there's a gender component to it, in terms of women and the types of things women might be expected to do working in a bar or a restaurant, or the abuse that somebody might take from a bad customer, but I need the tip. So there's a lot wrapped up in the notion of tipping. And again, one of the ongoing arguments was that, to have a dignified job, it would certainly be preferable not to have to rely on somebody's given whim or what they perceive as the level of service that I'm providing.
Yeah, and so is there a um a factor in here of gender and race that falls into all of these conversations of wages?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So one of the things that I have looked at is, and continue to look at in each of these chapters as we walk through this history, is the role of race and gender. Because at least, let's take women, the idea, women often first were unpaid. The idea was that when they did start to work, that really wasn't a natural or normal situation, that they were only working till they got married, they were only working for pin money or frivolous types of things, when the truth was that a lot of women increasingly worked because they had to. They were supporting themselves, they were supporting families. But the idea was that women, and that's when you started to get the idea. One of the interesting things, I have this trick question I like to ask in my classes, which is, when the minimum wage was first enacted in the between 1912 and 1920, It only applied to one group of workers.
Was the white white folks?
So yeah, see, it's interesting. People usually get this one wrong, and I'm not trying to tease or lord it over anybody, but people would often say that or to white men or whatever, but it was women. And the idea
Mm.
was that men actually, they didn't need a minimum wage. They were probably getting something. The assumption, not always right, was they were getting a family wage or something like that, but that women needed that sort of protection. And some of it was concern that women might fall into illicit activity. They might be forced into prostitution or other types of things to support themselves. It would deter them. They couldn't fulfill their role in the home, all of that. So the thought was that there needed to be some level of protection for women because women needed protection. Because it's interesting, you don't get the minimum wage that applies across boundaries of gender until the New Deal, the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, which is enacted. So there's always been the question about women. And of course, one of my, the question of equal pay for equal work has been with us for a long time. There were two favorite icons that I still have in my button collection from the early 70s. One is it simply says 59 cents.
Okay.
And you know what that one was
I
about?
I don't. Please.
Yeah, just say it was the idea that women earn 59 cents for every dollar on the average that men earn. So that kind of became the popular way of portraying that. Simply button said 59 cents. My other one is it has a like these two toddlers. One's a girl and one's a boy, and they're in their diapers, and they have their diapers extended, and they're looking down like this. And the girl says to the boy, "Oh, so that explains the difference in our salaries."
Mm. That
Yeah.
there's always an equivalent of that. I've seen that meme roaming around the internet in terms of talking about the difference between like computer models. It's interesting how imagery continues to be used. And so let's talk a little bit about what happened when Ronald Reagan becomes president, because I feel like we always put the blame on Ronald Reagan, despite the fact that it's been an ongoing struggle in this country. So, what happens in the 1980s when Reagan becomes president?
Hey, before I answer that, though, can I just say one thing? Because you had asked about black workers and women. I want to just say something about black workers, not to
Absolutely.
forget that, and then we can talk about Reagan if that's okay.
Absolutely.
But I just want to say that, we obviously have had, racial supremacy, systematic and structural. So black workers have often been disadvantaged in that regard, first being enslaved and not getting paid. And then after the Civil War, being confined to the lowest paying types of jobs and, some of the most dangerous jobs. And of course, the New Deal legislation in terms of the right to organize didn't cover farm workers or domestics. So lots of workers of color were excluded in that. And so there's always been this sense of both being shunted into jobs that were lower paying. And then the idea that, and also I've just seen this in the recent history I've been looking at, the idea that that black workers just didn't need as much to live on as other workers, that they had lower standards, lower expectations. And then you see the same thing. You don't need a higher wage because you're a spendthrift. You could live on what you have. That was used for white workers as well as black workers, but particularly for black workers. The idea was, uh, you're going to go out and spend it drinking or gambling or whatever. So why give you more money that you're going to squander? So there's been real structural explanations for this sort of exploitation, the types of job opportunities that people have had, and that's why black people have had, and that's why unions were so important in terms of beginning to negotiate a scale and an equal scale that covered both black and white workers. So I just want to put that in, and that's in every segment of the book, looking at how both black workers and women workers have been particularly disadvantaged on the wage front.
Yeah, it is. It's got to be particularly. Was it particularly bad for women who were minorities, or is it? Can we talk a little bit about that before getting into Ronald Reagan?
Sure. Well, as black women particularly have said for a long time that they were doubly cursed at one level, in the, quote unquote, in the sense of being black and female. So the idea was that, yeah, but both in terms of the types of work they got, the types of needs that they had, not really being regarded as bona fide workers, not needing a family or a decent wage, all those sorts of things. Or in the case of women, that this is a temporary status, or the type of work you're doing, how productive and important and useful was it? And that's why it's interesting, because when you look at, and I always preface this by saying I'm not advocating getting into world wars as a way of boosting opportunities and wages for workers, but because of the labor shortages, those were great opportunities for black workers, both male and female, and women of all races as well, to get higher paying jobs because the labor market allowed for that, and employers were getting guaranteed or at least large profits. So, but yeah, the idea of yeah, it's interesting. In 1969, 70, there was a strike of hospital workers in Charleston, South Carolina. And Coretta Scott King, and this was not long after her husband, Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated in Memphis. And Dr. King was a big labor guy, but which is sometimes neglected. But Coretta Scott King went to Charleston, and she just said that these women, the wage they were offering these women was an insult. And she pointed out that they were doubly disadvantaged by being black and female. So yeah, that's absolutely has been the case historically.
Yeah, and then, as we kind of move forward into Carter and then subsequently Reagan, who was very bad for, maybe not very bad, but Reagan was very hostile towards unions throughout his time, both as governor of California and as president. So let's talk a little bit about what Reagan did, maybe both as governor and as president, but I think as president is probably going to be a little more relevant.
Yeah, well, it's important to note that that Reagan actually started off as a New Dealer. He was fairly liberal early in his career, and then began to turn. And at least part of that was among others, anti-communism, reaction to the New Deal. He became a spokesperson, as you may know, for General Electric, and was exposed to a labor relations director, their architect of their labor relations, Lemuel Boulware, who was very much free market, free enterprise, pro-capitalist. And of course, taxation for Reagan was a big thing because he was earning money, didn't like to see his money taken away in taxes, becomes a Goldwater Republican, Barry Goldwater, and all of that. So Reagan is certainly no fan of unions, although he's not quite as, I mean, he certainly was against farm workers. And when Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and the United Farm Workers were organizing in California in the 60s, he's very much opposed to that. And when he becomes president, of course, he's certainly known for the PATCO strike, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers strike, where over 11,000 workers were fired, and there were federal workers who did not have the right to strike. But they had done that over the course of their history as a union. And while there had been some penalties and suspensions and discipline, no one had really went through with firing all of these workers. And the problems of the union, sometimes it's tempting to say that everything got really bad after Reagan, that was the turning point. I mean, I think it was a turning point in the sense that there were already trends that were not favorable to labor. Unions were already losing membership, the changing nature of work from manufacturing to service, capital flight, businesses moving abroad. There were a lot of different things going on that hurt unions. But one of the big things about Reagan was it ushered in this era. Well, so you think about, you had mentioned earlier, strikes. The strike is the labor's ultimate weapon. You withhold your labor in terms of providing a good or a service. It's not something I think workers jump to do as the first thing, but it is a last resort, and it's a powerful tool. But after Reagan, workers pretty much lost that tool. People were really frightened about striking. So what happened in the public sector or the federal sector spilled over to the private sector. There were a number of strikes in the 80s. Almost all of them got defeated. Greyhound, Phelps Dodge, the NFL players. You can go to copper miners in Arizona. You can just go down the line of unsuccessful strikes. And it ushered in an era of what came to be known as concession bargaining. So the way I describe this is that previously in collective bargaining, you think about bargaining each time out, you put a few bricks on the house. This time you get extra wages. This time you get more benefits. This time you get something as far as vacation or your pension or some contract language. But each time there's a brick on the house or maybe multiple bricks. Under concession bargaining, employers came in and they said, look, we're daring you to strike because we have the right to replace you. Increasingly, the political atmosphere condones that. So go ahead, but here's what we're offering. And it's essentially, we're not offering you very much, if anything at all, or we're saying the terms givebacks and takeaways entered the vocabulary of collective bargaining. We want wage concessions because of foreign competition. We want you to give up something as far as your pension or whatever. And so unions came to view collective bargaining as success, not as putting bricks on the house, but maintaining the bricks that you had. And so that made unions look less effective and less effective. And that was a lasting effect of Reagan. I mean, we've had a revival of strikes maybe in the last decade or so, but for many, many years, the number of strikes we had was almost microscopic. And the idea of workers exercising their collective power successfully through a strike or a job action, we didn't see much of that for many, many, many years.
Yeah, and so was that just because there was that fear, or were there other factors to be considered why people weren't striking as much?
I think fear was at the front of it. Fear that, and again, it was clear that employers, if they were determined, they had a lot of capacity in terms of how long they could hold out. They were more willing, and that's it. Kind of, what will the social or political atmosphere permit? There were periods of time in our history where I would say, wage strikes under what you might call Geneva rules of war. That there were certain things you could do as an employer, but you didn't do them because you thought that public opinion would not favor that, or even the government would not be so happy with it. But I think in the 80s and beyond, the idea was that these things actually would be okay to do, that people would accept that type of would accept you replacing people who went on strike or being very hard line in bargaining. So fear really was a large part of it. And then, of course, the fear of foreign competition, the fear of jobs being moved away, the idea of waging a successful strike just began to seem beyond the reach of many unions. And of course, membership was declining as well. So really, the union movement, I wouldn't say it gave up its right to strike. I mean, it certainly had that right, but it was much less willing to exercise it, particularly after watching. And there is a history, too, that you go on strike. It goes back long in our history. There's some that are successful and glorious and become the subject of stirring stories of daring do and heroism and don't cross picket lines and the roles that people had. And that's all true. But there are also strikes that didn't succeed. And, you have to reckon with those, you have to factor those in as well. And you just didn't see that many successful strikes in the 80s. So when you look at that and you go, well, gee, if there's the chance I'm going to be giving up wages and perhaps losing my livelihood, and how much do we gain? I think workers made that pragmatic calculation, and their unions, and said, we're not going to do this as readily as we once did.
Interesting. And so as we kind of wrap up here, are you seeing any trends currently that are, giving you thought as you write your book? Any trends that you're seeing now that you're like, I wonder if something is changing in this country, or anything like that?
Well, I think particularly, I'd say a couple of things, Justin. One is that if you think about wages, as I said before, I mean, I think this idea of affordability or what it takes to actually live, people are just seeing so many things get beyond their reach. And we ask a wage to do a lot of heavy lifting in this country. Our social safety net is not that strong or secure. We've gone from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution pensions, 401ks, and those are not always providing, often not providing people with what they need to have a secure retirement. So we've stripped away a lot of those things. We really ask a wage to do quite a bit. And people are just seeing that, and then with the return of inflation at fairly high levels, people just are having a hard time affording being able to live at a decent level. So I think that's a shared recognition, and the idea that people are asking for too much or making too much. I'm not hearing that argument so much. I think there's a greater sympathy for workers that are going on strike or trying to bargain, or the idea of raising the minimum wage. There's much more approval for that. So I see all of those things working positively. The idea of bringing back, people have been talking more about living wages, or talking about establishing sectoral boards in certain industries to set wage standards, such as the nursing industry, fast food. They did that in California. So I think you're seeing more and more a sense that people just can't afford the things they need to have a decent life for themselves and their families, and that's led to quite a lot of political activism and collective action.
Yeah, yeah. It'll be interesting to see where we go from here. We are obviously in the middle of a very big AI boom, and a lot of workers are being displaced. A lot of federal workers were displaced this year. So, Bob, as we wrap up here, where can people find more of your stuff if they've loved what you've said today?
Um, you mean about me personally?
Yeah, where can they find more of your writings, more of
Oh,
your, more from you, more from Bob?
yeah, no, I don't. I probably should. I don't actually have a website, but if you punch I mean, I will say this: a couple of things. I've written a fair amount of columns for a regional labor newspaper, particularly since I retired, called the Northwest Labor Press. So that's a place where I have columns, short columns that I've written on a range of subjects. I've written several times for a publication called The Conversation. So if you were to punch my name in either as Bob Bussel or Robert Bussel, I have a couple of books that you can find if you want to read me for a longer period of time, and they're biographies. That's one of the ways I've told historical stories. So, and then I do have some talks and other things I've given that are accessible too. So yeah, there's a range of ways to access some of the things that I've written about.
Thank you so much for your time today, Bob. I want to have you on the show again. We'll keep up to date, and we'll talk again soon, huh?
Thanks. It was my pleasure. Much appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening. This program is made possible by our lovely guests and the patronage of viewers like you. If you enjoyed the program you're listening to, share us with a friend to help them remember a story your city forgot. And of course, another way to help the program is to give us a review on the streaming platform you're listening on. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to brush your teeth. Alright, good. We all set?